Hello, my friends, hello, and welcome once again to Stately Vaughan Manor, where Roger and I have returned to talk about the much maligned Jules de Grandin. Jules de Grandin, created by Seabury Quinn, my favorite occult detective who appeared in Weird Tales magazine beginning in 1925. Jules de Grandin, the French detective and adventurer, occult detective and adventurer, who in the beginning of this series comes to visit his friend, Dr. Trowbridge, in Harrisonville and never leaves. He's the guest who never leaves. He just stayed with his friend in Harrisonville. Harrisonville, the most monster haunted city in America, full of more horrors and supernatural shenanigans than any place else. No wonder he never left. It was full of stuff that Jules de Grandin had to fight. And this is an awful fun series of stories. Now, the first time I heard about Seabury Quinn and Jules de Grandin was way back in the 1980s when I was becoming interested in H.P. Lovecraft and Robert E. Howard. I would hear a lot about Weird Tales magazine, the magazine where those writers first published their stories. And every time I would hear about Jules de Grandin or Seabury Quinn, it was not positive. I actually was surprised to learn that Seabury Quinn was one of the most popular, or possibly the most popular writer in Weird Tales, but his stories were terrible and he sucked. He was awful. Not like H.P. Lovecraft. Seabury Quinn sucked. Everybody seemed to say this. And I was reading this stuff in introductions and in, little articles and fanzines and places like that. Because this is, the late 80s, early 90s, before the internet was a thing. And all the criticism I found leveled against Seabury Quinn was pretty harsh. So I figured this guy was just the worst, because the word hack was thrown around quite often with Seabury Quinn. And so I thought, yeah, this guy must be the worst. And I became interested. I wanted to read his stories, but they weren't reprinted anywhere. There was a series of paperback books that was published in the 1970s that reprinted a lot of Jules de Grandin stories, but I could never find those paperbacks. Again, this is before the internet when you could just buy anything. I could never find those paperbacks, unfortunately. So I never read any Seabury Quinn until 2017, when they published, Nightshade Books published a 5-volume set, beginning with this volume, which collects all of the Jules de Grandin stories. And so, of course, I had to buy this book and read it. And I was really surprised because these stories are good. I mean, they're very pulpy, and they're not at the level of H.P. Lovecraft or Robert E. Howard or Clark Ashton Smith, to be sure, but they're very entertaining and they're fun. They're fun. And they're better stories than you would expect from the criticism that have been leveled against Jules de Grandin and Seabury Quinn, which made me wonder why. Why was he so hated? There were certainly worse pulp writers out there at the time. So what was going on with Seabury Quinn? Why was there so much criticism leveled against this writer? And that hasn't stopped. There's still a lot of criticism leveled against Seabury Quinn and his greatest creation, Jules de Grandin. I think a lot of it, looking back, had more to do with the literary reputation of H.P. Lovecraft than it had anything to do with Seabury Quinn. Because back in the 80s and the early 90s, H.P. Lovecraft had certainly not reached the status that he's reached today. He was still considered primarily a pulp writer of horror, which was not held in high regard in the 80s. The millions of paperbacks from hell that were printed in the 1980s did not help horror's status with critics. And so H.P. Lovecraft, despite being the most important writer of horror in the 20th century, it wasn't Stephen King, it was Lovecraft. Despite that, uh, his reputation wasn't great, and he had not reached the level of cultural importance that he has at this point in time. And part of that, I think, that fans of Lovecraft and people who loved Lovecraft's work, part of that was the kind of embarrassment that he published in Weird Tales, along with writers like Seabury Quinn. And so they had to say things like, Lovecraft, I mean, he's at a different level than these guys. And indeed, H.P. Lovecraft, he wasn't what I would consider a pulp writer. He was an artist. Lovecraft, his work was published in the pulps because literally nobody else would publish his work. He wrote weird stuff, supernatural stuff, and science fiction. Just things that were not published anywhere else outside of the pulps for the most part. But he also was a writer who would not want to alter his work for editors. Basically he would write his stories and say, hey, if you don't like it the way it is, just don't publish it because it's a masterpiece. It's the way I want it. And so Lovecraft was a different kind of writer. Seabury Quinn was very much a pulp writer. He wrote for pulps. He wrote for money, as most writers did. And he was writing a lot. He was writing the Jules de Grandin stories. At the same time, he was writing a series of detective stories and other stories that were not connected with his detective stories or his Jules de Grandin stories. He wrote other supernatural stories that were printed in Weird Tales. So he was writing a ton. And he was writing for money. And sometimes quality suffers when you do that. However, these are surprisingly good. There is a formula here. And the formula is pretty clear when you read one story after the other. But it's a formula that works. These stories are entertaining. And Jules de Grandin is a fun character. I mean, he's a bit ridiculous. He talks like Pepe Le Pew. He's certainly an eccentric character, but so what? Think about all of the eccentric detectives that are out there in literature. Are there any detectives that aren't eccentric in some way or another? At least he wasn't a drunk, Roger, like so many detectives are. So I wouldn't hold that against him, really. I mean, this is just fun stuff. One, it's like basically in Weird Tales, this was a Monster of the Month kind of series. Although he fought non-supernatural villains as well. He fought all kinds of pulpy villains and monsters and supernatural menaces. And they were ghastly. They were some of the grossest stuff that you'll find in the pulps in Weird Tales magazine you'd find in the Jules de Grandin stories. But I really think a big part of his reputation was how fans of Lovecraft and supporters of Lovecraft were trying to separate Lovecraft from other pulp writers. And Seabury Quinn, being popular and prolific, he was an easy writer to point to and say, hey, this guy, this is the example of a typical terrible Weird Tales writer, not like Lovecraft, who's great, which he is, There was a certain unfairness in that. And looking back, I start to feel like a lot of the writers who were just casually saying how terrible Seabury Quinn was probably never read a Seabury Quinn story. I suspect this happened more than once. However, he is still maligned, Seabury Quinn and Jules de Grandin. If you were to read S.T. Joshi's gigantic biography of H.P. Lovecraft, I Am Providence, Seabury Quinn in that biography is mentioned 3 times. Always, I think, with the word hack thrown in. And H.P. Lovecraft was not a fan of Seabury Quinn's work, as you might imagine. Didn't care for this type of story. But H.P. Lovecraft did meet Seabury Quinn in person at least twice at a couple different gatherings. And he had nice things to say about Seabury Quinn. So personally, he had no animosity against the guy. He just didn't like his stories. Whereas a lot of critics seem to have some personal animosity against Quinn, I feel like. S.T. Joshi, at the time that he wrote that biography, said that Seabury Quinn, his stories were in, oblivion justifiably, basically. He deserved the oblivion that he had reached. However, now we can read Seabury Quinn and we can read the Jules de Grandin stories, and we could make up our own minds. And I think it's a really fun series of stories. Seabury Quinn wrote the Jules de Grandin series from 1925 up until the early 50s, I believe. I forget exactly when he stopped. But he wrote these stories for a long time. And de Grandin was consistently popular. And despite critics being confused about how you could have a writer like Quinn be popular in a magazine that had greats like Robert E. Howard and H.P. Lovecraft and Clark Ashton Smith, he was very popular. And there were certainly far worse writers and stories published in Weird Tales than Seabury Quinn, that's for sure. He's fun. This is a fun series of stories. It's not great literature, but it wasn't trying to be great literature. It was trying to be what it was, which is a fun series of pulp stories. They're better, actually, than you would expect when you consider the fact that Seabury Quinn was really cranking them out. And I do recommend them. I recommend them. If you're interested, certainly, in the history of Weird Tales, Seabury Quinn was a huge part of Weird Tales. And he was a part of Weird Tales for a long time. Longer, unfortunately, than H.P. Lovecraft or Robert E. Howard, for sure. Those writers left a bigger mark. But Quinn, he was a big part of that magazine and the history of that magazine and in the history of pulp literature in general. And fun. This stuff is fun. Like I said, my favorite occult detective. And Seabury Quinn wasn't hated by everybody. Manly Wade Wellman was a writer who liked Quinn, and in his work would mention Jules de Grandin quite frequently, actually. So that was nice. So not everybody maligned Seabury Quinn, but he's gotten a lot of flack. And I'm here to say, you know what? This stuff's pretty good. It's pretty good. Okay, guys, I will catch you next time.